of an anthropological or a social aspect, where we take a look at how one's social status or social group or cultural group affects their food selections. So in cultural foods, we look at what it is that affects your personal food selections and how your culture or your background might affect that. We take a look at, the way I describe cultural foods, or the class, is we take a look at cultures around the world, and we travel the globe, and we study these people not from any other standpoint than just their food, how food fits within their culture, how they utilize food, what foods are very specific to them. I'm not an anthropologist, but we kind of take a look at food from an anthropological perspective, countries around the world, but also here in the United States, how people who immigrate here might hold on to some of their cultural beliefs and their food practices. And so what's kind of interesting is that we take a look at food from a necessity, a biological necessity standpoint, and then also a cultural or a social standpoint. There is. One of the things that I like to talk about when I start the semester with the Nutrition 310 class especially, is just getting into a discussion of how we define food. What is food? Because food for me might be very different than food for you or food for somebody else. And especially when we're talking about people coming from different countries, right? How they use food might be very unusual to me or to you. And so we get into that discussion about what food is. We also talk about the difference between feeding and eating and how humans are separate from animals. Animals feed and humans eat. And if you take a look at the history of food, really what separates us is with the invention of fire, or the discovery of fire, and how humans started cooking their food, right, before they eat it. And that separates us from animals also. And then that brings into a discussion about how different cultures cook their foods, what different utensils they might use, if there are any rules of etiquette surrounding food and eating, different rules, different manners. And so we talk about that too, because definitely how people in Japan might sit at a table and share a meal could be very different from how your family does, or my family, or somebody in Italy or in Norway. Okay, so we take a look at that too. And what we end up talking about a lot is how our food habits really are a reflection of who we are. You know. Okay, let's see if this works. All right, how many of you have heard this expression, you are what you eat? Have you heard that? So what does that mean to you? You are what you eat.
If you eat poorly, then you're going to have poor health. Or
Sure.
if you eat really healthy, then your body is going to show
Okay.
your weight and maybe like your complexion.
Okay. No, you're exactly right. In Nutrition 300, we talk about that. We talk about how the food choices that you make, the foods that you eat, literally become a part of your body. And so yeah, you definitely are what you eat. And this sort of gets at the physical or physiological transformation that occurs, right, with the food that you eat. How about this one? Have you ever heard this? You eat what you are. Have any of you ever heard that? You eat what you are. What do you think? How does that apply to you, do you think? You eat what you are. I mean, certainly I put up there cultural determination of food choice, but what does that mean? What do you think, Ed?
Well, I think, like, for example, probably people make ethical decisions if they are vegetarians or vegans. That's who they are.
That's who they are? Okay.
They'll have a diet that's appropriate for that.
Sure.
Well, just being in a culture, like here in America, we're surrounded by a culture that full of like fast food and whatnot. So it's kind of like we identify with like fast food. And
Okay.
So maybe like, oh, my family has eaten at McDonald's, since I was a kid. So
Okay.
I would go to McDonald's
Right.
It's a comfort and I'm used to it.
You're used to it, right? It's what you grew up with. It's very familiar to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you eat what you are. And that's really what we talk about a lot in cultural foods, whether it's the Nutrition 310 class or the 481 class. So getting at that, food really is identity. And I've got some pictures of food, and some of them you'll recognize and some of them you won't, but I recognize them. So pizza, right? Italian food, pretty typical Italian. This is Italian-style pizza. I was sure to get a picture that looked like Italian-style pizza and not American-style pizza because it's very different. I don't know if any of you ever had these? No? This is called pistache de Belém. Pistache de Belém. That's if they're from Belém. Anyway, it's a little custard pastry from Portugal. It's everywhere. If you go to Portugal, that's what you have to try. Does anybody know what this is? Probably not. What does it look like? Like some kind of a stew with beans. This is a dish called feijoada, which is the national dish of Brazil. Everybody has their own recipe for feijoada. And then I thought, well, what is more Japanese or more Chinese than a bowl of rice, right? I mean, certainly there are other cultures around the world that consume a lot of rice, but that's a huge part of Chinese or Japanese meal. You might recognize this. Anybody know what this is? You recognize it, Ed? That's pho, right? Pho. Have any of you had pho? P-H-O. Maybe you pronounced it pho, but it's pho. It's a really delicious Vietnamese soup. This is curry chicken, classic Indian dish. It's actually, interestingly enough, the national dish of London, believe it or not, because there's such a high population of Indians in London. And then this, I don't know if you could tell what that is. That's a tamale. So where's that from? Mexico, right? And a lot of other Central American countries have some version of that. So food is really something that helps people identify with who they are and where they came from. Oh, this one. This is paella. Forgot one last one, paella. Anyone know where paella is from? Ed. It's Spanish, yeah. There's a great Spanish restaurant in town that makes delicious paella. It's called Aioli Bodega de Española. It's on L Street. We talk a lot about food in my classes, too, and usually students leave the class rather hungry. What was this one? Oh, I kind of expected some Eastern European students in here. Anybody know what that might be? Borscht. Yeah. What are some foods that you eat because of your culture? I just gave you some examples. Strudel. Austria, Germany? Germany. Eddie? Tostadas. Mexico.
Hamburgers and hot dogs?
America or German? Do you know the hamburger originated in Germany, and the hot dog too, right? But we've kind of grabbed those as our own. German. So maybe. What about you guys? You can't think of anything that you eat? Hamburgers and hot dogs?
I don't know, maybe like seafood, shrimp and lobster.
Okay. Did your family come from like the coastal areas or?
No, they just really like it.
Okay.
I feel like it's like we kind of grab a lot of foods from other countries. And
Sure.
areas and
Sure.
kind of
It's a blend. Yeah. How about you? No? So my family comes from the Azores, which is an archipelago of islands off of Portugal. And so I identify with a lot of Portuguese food, like linguiça. Have you ever had linguiça? Some people call it linguica because they don't know, but the C with the little cedilla underneath it, it's linguiça. It's a Portuguese sausage. National soup of Portugal is something called caldo verde, which is this soup with kale in it. And as a little kid, I remember eating that. My grandmother made it all the time. She had a gigantic pot on the stove all the time. So we tend to hold on to those things. Don't know what's next. I was watching this Netflix show called Chef's Table, and it's a series on there. And one of the chefs was from Mexico, and she said this, and I thought it was really powerful. Through food, we can find home. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about food and cultural food especially is that, when people immigrate to a new country, they might start adopting a new way of life, but one of the very last things that they ever let go of for generations is their food patterns, their food habits. And because food connects us to our parents, to our ancestors, it connects us, if we've immigrated, it connects us to our home country. And it's comfort. It's something that we hold on to and we pass along to our children and for multiple generations after. And so I thought it was really profound. Through food, we can find home, This is kind of busy. This is kind of what we talk about in Nutrition 310 and Nutrition 481. We talk about how all of these different factors in our environment affect our food selections. And then sometimes we take that a step further and talk about how those food selections impact our health. So there's this maybe not direct connection between culture and health, but maybe indirect connection between culture and health. So our social environment affects what foods we select. Do you guys choose different foods when you're with your friends than you do with your family? Yeah. When you're at a certain type of social gathering versus a different type of social gathering, right? There might be specific foods to that. Your social organization. Technology. One of the articles that I have students read in both the 310 and the 481 classes is this article about, okay, you guys just read it. Food. The golden age of food processing. I'm sorry, I'm old. It takes me a little while to find the info. The golden age of food processing. And it focuses on how changes in technology and sort of changes in our society here in the United States led to the vast array of processed foods that we have. So technology affects our food supply, our food production, and thus our food selections. Another article that we read about is called Bread as World. And it focuses on bread making in Sardinia. Sardinia is an island off of Italy. Bread making in Sardinia before World War II and after World War II. So before advances in technology, it was very social. It was more communal. And then with advances in technology and mechanization and stuff like that, it went from making bread in home or community ovens to on a much more industrialized scale. And exactly what happened to those communities when it became more industrialized. All right, so our food habits are really developed through a lot of things. Our need for survival, obviously food is something that we need. Our need for security, for belonging to a certain group, and talking about etiquette and how there might be different rules within your group on how you approach food, consume food. There's also the symbolic use of food. Bread is very symbolic in a lot of cultures. Bread is the staff of life. When we get together, we break bread with each other. Do you know what that means? Breaking bread. Have you heard that term? What is it when you hear that? You don't know?
It's kind of like a communion, and it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. It's just like, oh, we're spending time together, having community with each other.
And it might not be literally breaking bread, but it means we're sitting down, we're having a meal together, we're connecting, right? It's a very intimate thing to share food. Bread is used as the body of Christ in either literal body of Christ, as in the Catholic Church, or the figurative body of Christ in a lot of other Christian churches. So bread ends up being a huge symbol in many cultures. Let's talk about food as comfort. Food is comfort. Have you heard the term comfort food? What does that mean to you? Comfort food. Because it's going to connect to the story. Comfort food.
I think of like soul food. I think of comfort food.
So do you have a dish or a particular food in mind?
Like
Mac and cheese. Comfort food. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when do you want that?
A lot.
A lot. Comfort food. What gives you comfort, Josh?
I mean, comfort food, like when I'm feeling like down or whatever, I go to a Mexican restaurant, hole in the wall, and I get chimichanga.
A chimichanga?
Yeah.
So fried and hot and
Yeah, just like.
covered with sauce?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah. Desserts bring you comfort. Comfort food. Okay, one more time? Oh, carne asada. Okay. So when I think of the term comfort food, my brain kind of goes in two different areas. It goes towards things like mac and cheese or soup or mashed potatoes. Does anyone think of it in a different way? Okay, ice cream. You know what it also could mean? Could be my grandmother's chicken and dumplings. Right? And why would that bring me comfort? Because I grew up in her kitchen and that's what she served to me. It was my favorite meal as a kid, and every time I went to visit, she made that for me. And so now, what happens? She passed away. When I think of chicken and dumplings, I'm immediately transported back to being that little kid in my grandmother's kitchen and her taking care of me, right? So sometimes comfort food is something warm and cheesy and ooey and gooey. Sometimes it makes us think of our mothers or our grandmothers, and for some reason it's usually women because that's who's doing the cooking. But if there's a man who, a father or grandfather that's doing the cooking, maybe it brings up memories of him.
Well, that's exactly where mine comes from. We go on my birthday. We go to this Mexican place, and so after my dad passed away, I find myself eating there like more often. It's just a connection, a way I can connect with him without him being here.
Right, absolutely. Comfort food ends up coming up in the story too. So it's not just here. Comfort food, maybe they don't call it comfort food in other countries or other cultures, but certainly it exists. Food is medicine. Have you ever heard that? Food is medicine. This comes up when we talk maybe about Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine is based on foods or herbs or roots. Definitely a connection there. Food is security. We can't really talk about other aspects of food until we satisfy that security, right? It goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You have to eat to survive, and you can't think of food as status if you don't even have the basic needs met. Okay. Josh, I think you're going to be talking about food deserts, aren't you, in the class? Yeah, food deserts.
I was making sure. I was like, dude, I hope it didn't fit desserts.
No, I think that's what you're going to do. Have you guys heard the term food deserts? So a food desert is a geographical area that has very limited access to healthy food. We don't think too much about food insecurity and lack of food here in this country because we overproduce food. But there are a lot of populations right here in our community where people have very limited access to food, where there's a lot of food insecurities. And so we talk about that in Nutrition 481. Josh is going to do his project on that. Food is expressive. Now, there are very few of you in here, so you're going to have to really participate. A lot of expressions have food in them, and this is just one of them. You're the apple of my eye. Have you heard that? You are the apple of my eye. So that's like a term of endearment, right? What are some other food expressions that you've heard?
You're the peanut butter to my jelly.
Really? You're the peanut butter to my jelly. So that's like, we're a perfect match.
Yeah.
Yeah? Or you complete me.
Something like that.
Something like that. You heard it in a song. Somebody else. Ed, can you think of any? Because it might be sort of dating myself a little bit here, right? I don't know if the younger generation has really heard of these, but
I thought of pie in the sky.
pie in the sky. So what does that mean?
It's just kind of like you have all these hopes and everything is
Yeah.
dreaming about something.
Yeah, pie in the sky. So that's like maybe unreachable goal, but you never know. Pie in the sky. You heard of any others? You heard of any? Eddie? Christina? You heard of any? Alex, have you heard of any? No? So even the title of the book, like Water for Chocolate, is a saying. It's not really water and chocolate, but it has to do with how in Mexico they make hot chocolate. They don't make it with milk, they make it with chocolate and water, and oftentimes chili. But it's the boiling water to melt the chocolate, and the boiling water is kind of violent, and so it has something to do with anger, passion. Were you going to say something? Make lemonade. Okay.
I would focus on it and say, I should know that's the way the cookie crumbles.
That's the way the cookie crumbles. So the salt of the earth. Some of these just come out because I've heard them so often. But have you heard that? The salt of the earth. No, Eddie? Might be a cultural thing. It means somebody is just grounded, like a good person, the salt of the earth, the bread of life. I mentioned that. How about this one? Bringing home the bacon. What does that mean? Bringing home the money. Ah, it's my bread and butter. Have you heard that? It's my bread and butter. What's that mean? Pardon? It's your job. It's what's paying the bills. It's your bread and butter. Maybe you do something else for fun, but teaching is my bread and butter, especially now that I have a kid in college. Can't. Okay, this one, I pulled this from the French. Mon petit chou. Anybody know what that means? Do the literal. Do you know the literal? My little cabbage. But it's not like you're referring to a Brussels sprout. It's a term of endearment, like a sweetheart. Mon petit chou. It does, right? Oh, my little cabbage. Yeah, that doesn't really work. It's a piece of cake. You heard that? Right? Easy. Don't cry over spilled milk. Have you heard that? What does that mean? It's no big deal. It's no big deal. Cup of tea. I use this one a lot. I'm not everyone's cup of tea. Hmm? You
I
use
think
it?
it's fine. I think I use it more or hear it more in the negative than the positive.
He's not my cup of tea. She's not my cup of tea. So, not my favorite, right? Not my favorite. Or, yeah, my favorite. How about this one? He's a bad apple. And I use the male pronoun. Have you heard that? A bad seed. Okay. So food, all cultures have some type of food-related expression, right? Food is so prevalent in our cultures, from consuming to how we talk, all kinds of things. Oh, comparing apples to oranges. That's another one. Food is very expressive, and it makes it into our literature. And then a lot of times movies are made from literature. And so one of the things that I think is kind of fun, and in my Nutrition 300 classes, I offer it as extra credit. And sometimes in the 310 or the 481 classes, we get into this, where I have students select a film, a movie, where food plays a central role, where it's a character in the film, practically. Soul Food is an example. You might have seen Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or maybe the more updated, more literal Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's supposed to be more along the lines of Roald Dahl's book. Some of these others, Tampopo, have any of you heard of Tampopo? Have you seen it, Ed? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, Babette's Feast. So these are just a few. Here's a more extensive list. So I give my students a list of these movies, and I tell them that they can watch it, and then they have to answer some questions or write some narrative about the movie and the role of food in that movie. Willy Wonka, Babette's Feast, Big Night, that's one of my favorites. It's from 1996. Big Night, these two brothers, Primo and Segundo, and they have a restaurant that is failing, and they're putting together a meal for their last big night, and it's the most extravagant Italian meal you've ever seen. That's fun. Chocolat. This is, there are two movies named Chocolat. This is the one with Johnny Depp, simply because I think he's pretty cute. At least back in 2000 he was. Now he's kind of weird. Chocolat is Chocolat is this really cute movie. It's set during the time of Lent, which in the Catholic calendar is a time where you abstain from pleasures. And it just so happens that in this little town in France, this woman in a red cape shows up with her daughter, and she makes chocolate. And it's the effects of chocolate on this little town. So it's kind of fun. Like Water for Chocolate, we'll talk about My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Soul Food, Tampopo, The Search for the Perfect Noodle Soup. And it's kind of a, what do they call it, a spaghetti western? I mean, it's kind of a comedy. It's fun. It's a fun movie. Tortilla Soup, Ratatouille. I even let students watch an animated film, Ratatouille, this little mouse who is this amazing chef, right? I mean, the whole movie is around food. Have any of you seen The Lunchbox? This is an Indian movie, and it's I think it's set in Mumbai. They have these services where women make lunches, and then the lunches are delivered to people. And it's this little love affair, sort of, that sparks between the woman making the lunch and the man who's eating the lunch. And it was this accidental crossing where he's getting somebody else's lunch, and these notes go back and forth. And have you seen it? No, it's a really cute movie. The 100-Foot Journey, have you guys seen that one? Set in France also, little hill town in France, two restaurants across the road from each other. Sideways, I thought I'd throw that in there about Merlot. Sales of Merlot tanked after that movie. They're on their way back up. Julie and Julia, this is so food related, and it's this woman, Julie, who decides to cook every recipe in Julia Child's book. Why can't I think of the name of the book? The Art of French Cooking, yeah. So anyway, have any of you seen any of these? Which ones? Ratatouille? Ratatouille. Yeah. My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I think the first one is more food focused than the second one, so I didn't put it on the list. Have you seen Soul Food? Charlie and the Chocolate Factory?
Yeah, Willy Wonka, Ratatouille, of course.
Yeah. Sideways. My Big Fat Greek, yeah. Yeah. And Ed, Christina? Have you? Yeah. Oh. So like Water for Chocolate, I think the book was published in about 1992. That sounds familiar. And then the movie came out a few years later. Kind of an interesting fun fact about the movie is the director was actually her husband. And so she had a pretty big influence in how the movie was made. I've heard, of course, the movie is never as good as the book. I've heard a lot of people complain that the actors that they chose for the movie didn't represent the visions that they had of those characters as they were reading the book, but how could they, right? How could they? So who's read the book? Who's seen the movie? None of you? You've read? You just saw the movie? So a little bit about, well, I told you that where the title comes from, Like Water for Chocolate. So a little bit about the book. The book is written in this style called magical realism. And if you've read any Gabriel Garcia Marquez, it's written in that same style where there are many questions as to what really happened because there are such exaggerations, right? So there's a very blurred line between what is real and what is exaggerated. It's set during the time of the Mexican Revolution in Mexico. And the main character is this young girl named Tita. And she's still a teenager. So through the, well, we start with her birth. But then through part of it, she's like 16 to 18 years old. And then at the very end of the book, she's about 38 or 39 years old. And it starts with her being born in the kitchen. And it turns out that her mother was chopping onions. And you know what onions make you do, right? They make you cry. And it was said that Tita was crying in the womb, right? So she was crying before she was even born. So when she was born, they didn't need to slap her on the bottom to get her to cry because she was crying already. And she was born through a flood of tears. And in the movie, they show that, where there's a literal flood. Or is it not literal? But there's like water everywhere. Kind of a strange thing. What happens is after the water dries, the cook sweeps up all of the salt and puts it in a container and then uses that salt when she's cooking. So Tita's lot in life was kind of established when she was born. She was born in the kitchen. And because she was the youngest, she was forbidden to marry. In that culture, the youngest daughter is supposed to not marry and supposed to take care of the parents. So she couldn't marry. She was raised in the kitchen by the cook, and so she felt more of a connection to the cook than she did to her own mother. When she's 16, she falls in love with this handsome man named Pedro, and he asks for her hand in marriage, and her mother forbids it and says, no, you may not marry Tita, but you may marry my other daughter, Rosara. And so he decides to marry her sister so that he can be close to her, right? And Tita is very sad, very depressed, very distraught about this, and then she pours all of her emotions into her cooking. And when people eat her food, they feel those emotions also, right? So the book is arranged in 12 chapters for each month of the year, and then there is a recipe that goes along with each chapter, and the food appears in some way in that chapter. So just an example of a few of the foods that are in the book and how they're used. I talked about the onions already and the tears and the fact that Tita was sobbing in her mother's womb and then the flood that occurred from those tears. One of the first things that Tita makes after her mother forbids her to marry Pedro is she has to make the wedding cake for her love and her sister. And she's in the kitchen making the cake and crying, right? And her tears are dropping into the cake batter. And then when all of the guests eat her cake, they feel her sorrow, and they just start sobbing uncontrollably. And then they get violently ill, and they all go and vomit, right? And then her mother gets really mad at her because she assumes that Tita poisoned the cake. Right? So in another chapter, Pedro brings her roses, and the mother refuses to let her have the roses and tells her to throw them away. Well, instead, she takes the roses and she makes this dish, quail in rose petal sauce. And it's this she's putting all of her love and all of her passion into making this dish. And then when she serves it around the table, we're okay talking about sex, right? We're all adults here. So when people are eating the quail and they're feeling her passion, and her sister's getting hot and aroused, and Pedro is getting really aroused, and that's just an example of how her food affects people. It affects people in the way that she was affected as she was making it. Oxtail soup, this comes a little bit later in the book. At some point, Tita leaves her home and she goes off to marry this doctor. And she's really sad and very depressed because she can't be with Pedro anymore. And so one of her closest friends comes to visit her and brings oxtail soup. Now, you probably think of a soup as very healing, right? You could probably, as you were growing up, maybe your mother made you chicken soup when you were sick, or right? It's comfort food. Well, for her, it has this healing effect, the oxtail soup. And then in another chapter, there's a recipe for Three Kings Day bread, and she makes that, and then it brings up all of these childhood memories of having the cake when she was a child, and just the closeness that she had to her sisters. All right, so how would I use this in the class? Well, I've never actually had students read a whole book. I think that's for my colleagues over in literature, English, or writing, or something like that. Right? I have students read much shorter articles. But, so how would I use this book? Well, I'd either have them read the book or watch the movie, and usually I'd have them watch the movie, and then I'd have them write a narrative, like 3 to 5 pages, about the presence of food in the story. How it's used, how it's important to the story, how it supports the story. What would the story be without the food, right? And in the case of like Water for Chocolate, I mean, there's so much that would be lost because everything centers around the kitchen and around Tita and her cooking. Does any character change because of their interactions with the food? In this story, all of the characters change somehow, if not permanently, certainly for the brief moment that they're consuming the food. In what ways are culture important to the portrayal of the food? How would these be different in another culture? I like to get students comparing cultures. How something happens in this book, Mexican culture with food, and contrast that to another culture. Maybe they're similar. Maybe there are some similarities. Maybe there are great differences. But I like to get students thinking about that. And then also I like to get them to personalize it. How would this relate to you? Are there any foods you can think of that might give you a warm feeling? Maybe not that kind of a warm feeling, but a warm feeling, right? Just like we were talking about comfort food. We're talking about the healing properties of food. Are there any foods that would be similar to the oxtail soup that somebody might bring you if you were sick or depressed? Is there any food that you eat and you just go, oh, that. And that's what I do with dark chocolate, right? I mean, it's intoxicating, just the smell of it. right? And you put it in your mouth, and it's just warm and smooth and sweet. And I know you don't like dark chocolate, but right? So anyway, that's how I would use the book in my class. It gives you a little bit of information about cultural foods of the world and how we use literature or movies or some type of, I don't know, something like that. So, you guys have any questions? No? Yeah.
What was your favorite part of this book?
So I like the birth part because that's so interesting. I like the quail and the rose petal sauce and the sister Gertrudis and how she got sort of consumed with passion and ended up getting carried off by some general in the army and right. What was your favorite part? The tears on the cake. Right.
I didn't read the book.
Yeah.
It was because there were so many years that the story continued.
Right.
Just seeing how the tears affected different stages.
Yeah. Yeah, the tears do come back. Yeah, it's just, the transference of emotions. Do you guys cook at all? You cook? Not really? It's kind of a generational thing, I think. Do you cook?
I bake.
You bake?
I'm not a good cook, but I like to bake.
And do you bake for other people?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you're baking for somebody, if it's somebody special, right? I mean, you put a lot of yourself into that, right? I mean, not like T did.
I don't weed into the baking.
Right, but
Like, I remember a long time ago, I read somewhere that, when you're making something or even when you're wrapping a gift, you want to have positive thoughts because when it's eaten or when it's unwrapped,
yeah.
that's going to come out.
Yeah, it's the energy that you put into it, right? Yeah. Ed, do you cook at all? Do you? I mean, can you relate? Right?
I like to think about because I'm the one that makes most of the meals in our house, and I always sort of think about what I made for my wife and my son and how they would enjoy it, and especially when I'm making things for my son, I'm
Right.
introducing him to things that my mom made for me.
Right.
You like, I really like this when I do it.
Right.
It's very gratifying when this is really great. It's a little bit of a bummer when you put a lot of work into something. It's like, oh my goodness, can I have hot dogs instead?
Well, but how old is he?
He's 8.
Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, anybody who cooks, I think, unless you're just making something quick, right? But if you're making a nice meal, you do put a lot of yourself into it. And you do put a lot of emotions into it. And especially if you're making it for someone else, right? You're wanting them to have this great experience. It's a gift. It's a gift. Right.
When it's a meal for an occasion, especially, or if someone's sick, you're creating. It's not just food for the nourishment of it, but more for your soul.
Your soul. Yeah. Yeah. And if you've ever had someone make a meal for you, maybe you've had a hard time and somebody's dropping food off. I mean, it's a connection. It's such a connection. I love teaching this. I love teaching this class. Food is a passion of mine. I don't have any hobbies. If I were to have a hobby, it would be food. I mean, and maybe that is a hobby. But yeah, it's just a passion. There's so much surrounding food, right, that I think many people take for granted. So anyway, talking about cooking for your son. My son's 18 and a half. I just moved him to Los Angeles for college. And he said, Mom, I need you to teach me how to make your bolognese. I need to make that. And your chicken, I make this panko, we just call it panko chicken, but it's pounded chicken cutlets fried, right? And it's fried chicken. The nutritionist makes fried chicken. But there are certain meals that he loves, and he wants to know how to make them because, he's going to be 30 years old, 40 years old, cooking for his family, making my bolognese, and he'll be thinking of me when he's doing it, right? So that's what food is about for me. So anyway, that's it. Questions?